This is StoryLink Radio. The professional storytellers at StoryLink Radio have been around for a long time. The Irish knew storytellers by the name Shawnee. We are committed to bringing stories to life through the spoken word as in traditional oral storytelling. We present stories of many genres: ancient myths and legends, short stories, full-length novels, science fiction, high fantasy, philosophy, traditions, classics, drama, fiction, nonfiction, romance, theater, ghosts and haunts, stories of the strange, and much, much more. Our stories may be drawn from contemporary sources or from some dusty, near-forgotten tome. Regardless, it is a treat like no other to listen to stories and tales presented in a live format with the emotion and feeling a true professional storyteller brings, conjuring up images of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. So join us at StoryLink Radio and let us be your Shawnee for a time. Our stories are presented before a live audience, then recorded for the StoryLink Radio podcast for your on-demand listening pleasure. Please visit StoryLinkRadio.com for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Visit www.StoryLinkRadio.com. The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. Chapter 1. The September sun, losing some of its heat, if not its brilliance, was dropping low in the west over the black Colorado range. Purple haze began to thicken in the timbered notches. Gray foothills, round and billowy, rolled down from the higher country. They were smooth, sweeping, with long velvety slopes and isolated patches of aspens that blazed in autumn gold. Splotches of red vine colored the soft gray of sage. Old White Slides, a mountain scarred by avalanche, towered with bleak rocky peak above the valley, sheltering it from the north. A girl rode along the slope, with gaze on the sweep and range and color of the mountain fastness that was her home. She followed an old trail which led to a bluff overlooking an arm of the valley. Once it had been a familiar lookout for her, but she had not visited the place of late. It was associated with the serious hours of her life. Here, 7 years before, when she was 12, she had made a hard choice to please her guardian, the old rancher whom she loved and called her father, who had indeed been a father to her. That choice had been to go to school in Denver. 4 years she had lived away from her beloved gray hills and black mountains. Only once since her return had she climbed to this height, and that occasion, too, was as memorable as an unhappy hour. It had been 3 years ago. Today, girlish ordeals and griefs seemed back in the past. She was a woman at 19, and face to face with the first great problem in her life. The trail came up back of the bluff, through a clump of aspens with white trunks and yellow fluttering leaves, and led across a level bench of luxuriant grass and wildflowers to the rocky edge. She dismounted and threw the bridle. Her mustang, used to being petted, rubbed his sleek, dark head against her, and evidently expected like demonstration in return. But as none was forthcoming, he bent his nose to the grass and began grazing. The girl's eyes were intent upon some waving, slender white and blue flowers. They smiled up wanly, like pale stars out of the long grass that had a tinge of gold. "Columbines," she mused wistfully, as she plucked several of the flowers and held them up to gaze wonderingly at them, as if to see in them some revelation of the mystery that shrouded her birth and her name. Then she stood with a dreamy gaze upon the distant ranges. "Columbine, so they named me, those miners who found me, a baby lost in the woods, asleep among the columbines." She spoke aloud, as if the sound of her voice might convince her. So much of mystery of her had been revealed that day by the man she had always called her father. Vaguely she had always been conscious of some mystery, something strange about her childhood, some relation never explained. "No name but Columbine," she whispered, sadly, and now she understood a strange longing of her own heart. Scarcely an hour back, as she ran down the wide porch of White Slides ranch house, she had encountered the man who had taken care of her all her life. He had looked upon her as kindly and fatherly as of old, yet with a difference. She seemed to see him as old Bill Bellams, pioneer and rancher, of huge frame and broad face, hard and scarred and grizzled, with big eyes of blue fire. "Golly," said the old man, "I reckon y'all's news, a letter from Jack. He's coming home." Belllounds had waved a letter. His huge hand trembled as he reached to put it on her shoulder. The hardness of him seemed strangely softened. Jack was his son. Buster Jack, the range had always called him, with other terms less kind, that never got to the ears of his father. Jack had been sent away 3 years ago, just before Columbine's return from school. Therefore, she had not seen him for over 7 years. But she remembered him well. A big, rangy boy, handsome and wild, who had made her childhood almost unendurable. "Yes, my son Jack. He's coming home," said Belllounds with a break in his voice. "And Collie, now I must tell you something." "Yes, Daddy," she had replied, with strong clasp of the heavy hand on her shoulder. "Yeah, it's just it, lass. I ain't your dad. I've tried to be a dad to you, and I've loved you as my own, but, well, you're not flesh and blood of mine. And now I must tell you." The brief story followed. 17 years ago, miners working a claim of Belllounds in the mountains above Middle Park had found a child asleep in the columbines along the trail. Near that point, Indians, probably Arapahoes, coming across the mountains to attack the Utes, had captured or killed the occupants of a prairie schooner. There was no other clue. The miners took the child to their camp. They fed and cared for it, and after the manner of their kind, they named it Columbine. Then they brought it to Belllounds. "Collie," said the old rancher, "it needn't never have been told. It wouldn't but for one reason. I'm getting old, Collie. I reckon I'd never split my property between you and Jack, so I mean you and him to marry. You always steadied Jack. With a wife like you, he'll be, well, maybe Jack'll..." "Dad," burst out Columbine, "marry Jack? Why, I don't even remember him." "Ha ha ha ha!" laughed Belllounds. "Well, you doggone soon will. Jack's in Kremlin, and he'll be here tonight or tomorrow." But I don't love him," faltered Columbine. The old man lost his mirth. The strong lined face resumed its hard cast. The big eyes smoldered. Her appealing objection had wounded him. She was reminded of how sensitive the old man had always been to any reflection cast upon his son. "Well, that's just unlucky," he replied gruffly. "Maybe you'll change. I reckon no girl could help a boy much unless she cared for him. Anyway, you and Jack will marry." He had stalked away, and Columbine had ridden her Mustang far up the valley slope where she could be alone. Standing on the verge of the bluff, she suddenly became aware that the quiet and solitude of her lonely resting place had been disrupted. Cattle were bawling below her and along the slope of old white slides and on the grassy uplands above. She had forgotten that the cattle were being driven down into the lowlands for the fall roundup. A great red and white spotted herd was milling in the park just beneath her. Calves and yearlings were making the dust fly along the mountain slope. Wild old steers were crashing in the sage, holding level, unwilling to be driven down. Cows were running and lowing for their lost ones. Melodious and clear rose the clarion calls of the cowboys. The cattle knew those calls, and only the wild steers kept up grade. Columbine also knew each call and to which cowboy it belonged. They sang and yelled and swore, but it was all music to her. Here and there along the slope where the aspen groves clustered, a horse would flash across an open space. The dust would fly, and a cowboy would peal out a lusty yell that rang along the slope and echoed under the bluff and lingered long after the daring rider had vanished in the steep thickets. "I wonder which is Will's," murmured Columbine as she watched and listened, vaguely conscious of a little difference, a strange check in her remembrance of this particular cowboy. She felt the change, yet did not understand. One after one, she recognized the riders on the slopes below, but Wilson Moore was not among them. He must be above her then, and she turned to gaze across the grassy bluff up the long yellow slope to where the gleaming aspens half hid a red bluff of mountain towering aloft. Then from far to her left, high up a scrubby ridge of the slope, rang down a voice that thrilled her. "Go along, you old Red cattle dashed pell-mell down the slope, raising the dust, tearing the brush, rolling rocks, and letting out hoarse bawls. Whoopee! High-pitched and pealing came a clearer yell. Columbine saw a white Mustang flash out on top of the ridge, silhouetted against the blue with mane and tail flying. His gait on that edge of the steep slope proved his rider to be a reckless cowboy for whom no heights or depths had terror. She would have recognized him from the way he had rode if she had not known the slim, erect figure. The cowboy saw her instantly. He pulled the Mustang, about to plunge down the slope, and lifted him, rearing and wheeling. Then Columbine waved her hand. The cowboy spurred his horse along the crest of the ridge, disappeared behind the grove of aspens, and came in sight again round to the right, where in the grassy bench he slowed to a walk in descent to the bluff. The girl watched him come, conscious of an unfamiliar sense of uncertainty in this meeting, and of the fact that she was seeing him differently from any other time of the years he had been a playmate, a friend, almost like a brother. He had ridden for Belllounds for years, and was a cowboy because he loved cattle well and horses better, and above all, a life out in the open. Unlike most cowboys, he had been to school. He had a family in Denver that objected to his wild range life and often importuned him to come home. He seemed aloof sometimes and not readily understood. While many thoughts whirled around Columbine's mind, she watched the cowboy ride slowly down to her, and she became more concerned with a sudden restraint. How was Wilson going to take the news of this forced change about to come in her life? That thought leapt up. It gave her a strange pang. But she and he were only good friends. As to that, she reflected of late that they had not been the friends and comrades they formerly were. In the thrilling uncertainty of this meeting, she had forgotten his distant manner and the absence of little attentions she had missed. Now this time the cowboy had reached the level. With the lazy grace of his kind, slipped out of the saddle. He was tall, slim, round-limbed, with the small hips of a rider, and square, though not broad, shoulders. He stood straight like an Indian. His eyes were hazel, his features regular, his face bronzed. All men of the open had still, lean, strong faces, but added to this in him was a steadiness of expression, a restraint that seemed to hide sadness. "Oh, howdy, Columbine. What are you doing up here? You might get run over."
"Hello, Wills,"
she replied slowly.
"Oh, I guess I can keep out of the way."
"Yeah, well, there's some bad steers in that bunch, Columbine. If any of them run over here, Pronto will leave you to walk home. That Mustang hates cattle, and he's only half broke, you know."
"Well, I forgot you were driving today,"
she replied, looked away from him. There was a moment's pause. Long, it seemed to her. What'd you come for?" he asked curiously.
"Well, I wanted to gather columbines, see?"
She held out the nodding flowers toward him.
"Take one. Do you like them?"
"Yes, I like columbine," he replied, taking one of them. His keen hazel eyes softened and darkened. "Colorado's flower."
"Columbine, it's my name."
"Well, could you have a better? It sure suits you."
"Why?"
she asked, and looked at him again. "You're slender, graceful. You sort of hold your head high and proud. Your skin is white, your eyes are blue. Not bluebell blue, but columbine blue. They turn purple when you're angry."
"Compliments. Wilson, this is a new kind of talk for you."
"You're different today."
"Yes, I am."
She looked across the valley toward the westering sun, and the slight flush faded from her cheeks.
"I have no right to hold my head proud. No one knows who I am, where I came from."
"As if that made any difference," he exclaimed.
"Belllounds is not my dad. I have no dad. I was a waif. They found me in the woods, a baby, lost among the flowers. Columbine Belllounds I've always been, but, well, that is not my name. No one can tell what my name really is."
"Oh, heck, I knew your story years ago, Columbine. Everybody knows. Old Bill ought to have told you long before this, but he loves you. So does everybody. You must not let this knowledge sadden you. I'm sorry you never known a mother or sister. Why, I could tell you many orphans whose stories were different."
"You don't understand. I've been happy. I've not longed for anyone except a mother. It's only...
What don't I understand?
Well, I've not told you all.
No? Well, go on, then. Meaning of the hesitation and the restraint had obstructed her thoughts now flashed over Columbine. It lay in what Wilson Moore might think of her prospective marriage to Jack Belllounds. Still, she could not guess why that should make her feel strangely uncertain of the ground she stood on, or how it could cause a constraint she had to fight herself to hide. Moreover, to her annoyance, she found that she was evading his direct request for the news she had withheld.
Jack Belllounds is coming home tonight, or tomorrow.
And then, waiting for her companion to reply, she kept an unseeing gaze upon the scanty pines fringing old Whiteslides. But no reply appeared to be forthcoming from Moore. His silence compelled her to turn to him. The cowboy's face had subtly altered. It was darker with a tinge, red under the bronze, and his lower lip was released from his teeth, even as she looked. He had his eyes intent upon the lasso he was coiling. Suddenly he faced her, and the dark fire of his eyes gave her a shock. "I've been expecting that shorthorn back for months," he said bluntly.
You never liked Jack?
Queried Columbine slowly. That was not what she wanted to say, but the thought spoke itself. "I should smile I never did."
Ever since you and he fought, long ago, all over...
His sharp gesture made the coiled lasso loosen. "Ever since I licked him good, don't forget that," interrupted Wilson. The red had faded from the bronze.
Yes, you licked him,
mused Columbine.
I remember that. And Jack's hated you ever since.
There's been no love lost.
But, Wills, you never before talked this way, spoke out so against Jack,
she protested. "Well, I'm not the kind of talk behind a fellow's back, but I'm not mealy-mouthed either, and... He did not complete the sentence, and his meaning was enigmatic. Altogether, Moore seemed not like himself. The fact disturbed Columbine. Always she had confided in him. Here was a most complex situation. She burned to tell him, yet somehow fear, or, well, she felt an incomprehensible satisfaction in his bitter reference to Jack. She seemed to realize that she valued Wilson's friendship more than she had known. And now, for some strange reason, it was slipping away from her.
We were such good friends. Pards,
said Columbine hurriedly and irrelevantly. "Who?" He stared at her.
Why, you and me.
"Oh." His tone softened, but there was still disapproval in his glance. "What of that?"
Well, something has happened to make me think I've missed you lately. That's all.
Uh-huh. His tone held finality and bitterness, but he would not commit himself. Columbine sensed a pride in him that seemed the cause of his aloofness.
Wilson, why have you been different lately?
Well, was it good to tell you now? That gave her a blank sense of actual loss. She had lived in dreams, and he in realities. Right now, she could not dispel her dream, see and understand all that he seemed to. She felt like a child then, growing old swiftly. The strange past longing for a mother surged up in her like a strong tide. Someone to lean on, someone who loved her, someone to help her in this hour when fatality knocked at the door of her youth. Oh, how she needed that.
It might be bad for me to tell me, but tell me, anyhow,
she said finally, answering as someone older than she had been an hour ago, to something feminine that leapt up. She did not understand this impulse, but it was in her. "No," declared Moore, the dark red staining his face. He slapped the lasso against his saddle, and he tied it with clumsy hands. He did not look at her. His tone expressed anger and amaze.
Dad says I must marry Jack,
she said, with a sudden return to her natural simplicity. "Yeah, I heard him tell that months ago," snapped Moore.
You did? Was that... Why?
"It was."
But that was no reason for you to to stay away from me. Wills, didn't you like me any more after Daddy said that?
"Columbine, A girl 19 years about to get married ought not to be a fool.
I'm not a fool.
You ask fool questions.
Well, you didn't like me afterward, or you'd never mistreated me.
If you say I mistreated you, you say what's untrue. They had never been so near a quarrel before. Columbine experienced a sensation new to her, a commingling of fear, heat, and pang. It seemed all in one throb. Wilson was hurting her. The quiver ran all over her, along her veins, swelling and tingling.
You mean I lie?
Yes, I do, if... But before he could conclude, she slapped his face. It grew pale then while she began to tremble.
Oh, I did not intend that. Forgive me.
He rubbed his cheek. The hurt had not been great, so far as the blow was concerned, but his eyes were dark with pain and anger. Oh, don't distress yourself. You slapped me before, once, years ago, for kissing you. I apologize for saying you lied. You're only out of your head. So am I. That poured oil upon the troubled waters. The cowboy appeared to be hesitating between sudden flight and the risk of staying longer.
Well, maybe that's it,
replied Columbine with a half-laugh. She was not far from tears and fury with herself.
Let us make up. Be friends again.
Moore squared around aggressively. He seemed to fortify himself against something in her. She felt that. But his face grew harder and older than she had ever seen it. Columbine, do you know where Jack Belllounds has been for these 3 years? He asked, deliberately, entirely ignoring her overtures of friendship.
No. Somebody said Denver. Someone else said Kansas City. I never asked Dad because I knew Jack had been sent away. I've supposed he was working, making a man of himself.
Well, I hope to heaven, for your sake, what you suppose comes true, returned Moore with exceeding bitterness.
Do you know where he's been?
Some strange feeling prompted that. There was a mystery here. Wilson's agitation seemed strange and deep. Yeah, I do. The cowboy bit that out through closing teeth as if locking them against an almost overmastering temptation. Columbine lost her curiosity. She was woman enough to realize that there might well be facts which would only make her situation harder.
Wilson, I owe all I am to Dad. He's cared for me, sent me to school. He's been so good to me. I've loved him always. It would be shabby return for all his protection and love if I refused.
Old Bill is the best man ever, interrupted Moore, as if to repudiate any hint of disloyalty to his employer. Everybody in Middle Park and all over owes Bill something. He's sure good. There never was anything wrong with him except his crazy blindness about his son, Buster Jack. The Columbine put a hand over Moore's lips.
The man I must marry.
You must? You will?
Of course. What else could I do? I never thought of refusing.
Columbine! Wilson's cry was so poignant, his gesture so violent, his dark eyes so piercing that Columbine sustained a shock that held her trembling and mute. How can you love Jack Belllounds? You were 12 years old when you saw him last. How can you love him?
I don't.
Then how could you marry him?
I owe Dad obedience. It's his hope that I can steady Jack.
Steady Jack? Why, you girl, you white-faced flower. You with your innocence and sweetness steady that damned pup. My heavens, he was a gambler and a drunkard.
Hush.
He cheated at cards, declared the cowboy with a scorn that placed that vice as utterly base.
Jack was only a wild boy,
replied Columbine, trying with brave words to champion the son of the man she loved as her father.
He has been sent away to work. He'll have outgrown that wildness. He'll come home a man.
Bah! cried Moore harshly. Columbine felt a sinking within her. Where was her strength? She who could walk and ride so many miles, become sick with an inward quaking? It was childish. She struggled to hide her weakness from him.
It's not like you to be this way. You used to be generous. Am I to blame? Did I choose my life?
Moore looked quickly away from her, and standing with hand on his horse, he was silent for a moment. The squaring of his shoulders bore testimony to his thought. Presently he swung up into the saddle. The mustang snorted and champed the bit and tossed his head ready to bolt. "Forget my temper," begged the cowboy, looking down upon Columbine. "I take it all back. I'm sorry. Don't let a word of mine worry you. I was only jealous."
Jealous?
"Yes. That makes a fellow see red and green. Bad medicine. You never felt it."
What were you jealous of?
The cowboy had himself in hand now, and he regarded her with a grim amusement. "Well, Columbine is like a story. I'm the fellow disowned by his family, a wanderer of the wilds, and no good, no prospects. Now our friend Jack, well, he's handsome and rich. He has a doting old dad, cattle, horses, ranches. He wins the girl. See?" Spurring his mustang, the cowboy rode away. At the edge of the slope, he turned in his saddle. "I've got to drive in this bunch of cattle. It's late. You hurry home." Then he was gone. The stones cracked and rolled down under the side of the bluff. Columbine stood where he had left her, dubious, yet with the blood still hot in her cheeks.
Jealous? He wins the girl,
she murmured in repetition to herself.
Whatever could he have meant? He didn't mean... He didn't...
The simple, logical interpretation of Wilson's words opened Columbine's mind to a disturbing possibility of which she had never even dreamed. That he just might love her. If he did, why had he not said so? Jealous, maybe, but he did not love her. The next throb of thought was like a knock at the door of her heart, a door never yet opened, inside which seemed a mystery of feeling, of hope, despair, unknown longing, and clamorous voices. The woman just born in her, instinctive and self-preservative, shut that door before she had more than a glimpse inside. Then she felt her heart swell with its nameless burdens. Pronto was grazing near at hand. She caught him and mounted. It struck her then that her hands were numb with cold. The wind had ceased fluttering the aspens, but the yellow leaves were falling, rustling. Out on the brow of the slope she faced home and the west. A glorious Colorado sunset had just reached the wonderful height of its color and transformation. The sage slopes below her seemed rosy velvet. The golden aspens on the farthest reaches were on fire at the tips. The foothills rolled clear and mellow and rich in the light. The gulf of distance onto the great black range was veiled in mountain purple, and the dim peaks beyond the range stood up, sunset flushed and grand. The narrow belt of blue sky between crags and clouds was like a river full of fleecy sails and wisps of silver. Above towered a pall of dark cloud, full of the shades of approaching night.
"Oh, beautiful,"
breathed the girl, with all her worship of nature. That wild world of sunset grandeur and loneliness and beauty was hers. Over there, under a peak of the Black Range, was a place where she had been found, a baby lost in the forest. She belonged to that, and so it belonged to her. Strength came to her from the glory of light on the hills. Pronto shut up his ears and checked his trot.
"What is it?"
called Columbine. The trail was getting dark. Shadows were creeping up the slope as she rode down to meet them. The mustang had keen sight and scent. She reined him to a halt. All was silent. The valley had begun to shade on the far side, and the rose and gold seemed fading from the nearer. Below, on the level floor of the valley, lay the rambling old ranch house with cabins nestling around, and the corrals leading out to the soft hay fields, misty and gray in the twilight. A single light gleamed. It was like a beacon. The air was cold with a nip of frost. From far on the other side of the ridge she had descended came the bawls of the last straggling cattle of the roundup. But surely Pronto had not shut up his ears for them. As if in answer, a wild sound pealed down the slope, making the mustang jump. Columbine had heard it before.
"Pronto, it's only a wolf."
The peal was loud, rather harsh at first. then softened to a mourn, wild, lonely, haunting. A pack of coyotes barked in angry answer, a sharp staccato yelping chorus, the more piercing notes biting on the cold night air. These mountain mourns and yelps were music to Columbine. She rode on down the trail in the gathering darkness, less afraid of the night and its wild denizens than of what awaited her at White Slides Ranch. You've just heard Chapter 1 of The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey. Please join us again soon for the next chapter. Thank you for listening to StoryLink Radio. If you like what you've just heard, we hope you will subscribe to our podcast and pass along our web address, www.storylinkradio.com. Be sure to visit our website for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Join us next time for another story from StoryLink Radio.